Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming out tonight to this global travelogue of water and our relationship with it. I'm Nate, the programmer at Imagine Science Films, and I'd like to invite up the panel discussion for tonight, actually. Mohammed Yahya is going to be our moderator. He's the editor of Nature Middle East, and we're excited to have him here. John Burt is a marine biologist here in Abu Dhabi, an expert in coral reefs of this whole region. Also Colin Ford, a marine biologist from Miami, where he's been identifying the unique adaptations of urban corals. And finally, Lars Jan, whose work in Holocenes looks at sort of our lives underwater soon, maybe. So thanks for coming out, and I hope you'll enjoy the conversation.
All right, thanks everyone for joining us this evening, and I'm sure everyone is pretty stunned by the visual journey we just had with the movie. It was quite something, I must say. So my name is Mohammed Yahya. I'm the executive editor of Nature Publishing Group in the Middle East, and I'm very happy to be here tonight. At Nature, we've long had this ongoing relationship with Imagine Science, and it's absolutely wonderful to see it coming to the Middle East and to Abu Dhabi now. It's quite an interesting region to look at when it comes to science. There's a lot of things going on in science around the region, around the Gulf states. And it's activities like this that actually bring that science out to the public that I find absolutely thrilling. It gives the people a chance to get in touch with that science and to know more about what's happening and to care more about what the scientists are doing in the labs, which is often a complete mystery to many of us. So that's why I'm particularly excited to be here, and we're very happy to be supporting Imagine Science in Abu Dhabi. So without further delay, I'd like to welcome our panelists today, and each of them is going to give a little introduction about who they are, what they do, and then we'll go into a discussion, and then we'll also have time to take questions from the audience. So if you have any questions you would like to ask our panelists, please keep them ready. So first, I'll go with John Burt, who's a marine biologist working here in NYUAD, and he's studying the coral reefs of the Arabian Sea and the other water bodies in the region. So on to you, John.
Thank you. So I'm just going to start by showing you a picture. This is a coral reef that's located just off of Abu Dhabi. It's probably about a 45-minute boat ride from here. And a lot of people that live here in the city don't recognize that we have these beautiful and valuable ecosystems on our doorsteps. You know, globally, coral reefs are worth an estimated $500 million a year in sort of economic value from the products and services that they provide. And it's coral reefs like this that are off of our shore that are also equally important. We have several $100 million in commercial fisheries in the Gulf states, and many of the fish that we eat are coming off of these reefs. They usually start their life in a habitat just like this. So this is Surbunair Island. As you've probably heard in the media, you can't really avoid the conversation of climate change and its impacts on reefs globally. We're estimated to have lost about 20% of coral reefs in the world already as a result of climate change and local stressors. But I work here for a reason. The reason I work here is because this is one of the most interesting and informative places from the perspective of climate change for this reason. When you look, so this is sea surface temperature in the Arabian region in August last summer. And what you can see is right off of our doorstep, we're hitting temperatures of 34 degrees Celsius, and it stays that temperature each summer. And I regularly see on reefs here and just off of Abu Dhabi, 36 degrees Celsius. And to put that into context, if you think in Fahrenheit, that's basically the same temperature as your blood. It's the temperature slightly below what you would draw in a bath at home when you want to relax. So this is pretty hot water. Yet we have beautiful coral reef fauna, like you just saw in the last picture, that live here just off of our shore. And we also have these other interesting seas nearby, the Red Sea, deep, It doesn't quite get the extreme temperatures that we have, but it does have very high salinity in the northern areas up by the Gulf of Aqaba. And then you'll notice that purple plume that's coming off of the Omani coast there. Well, they have coral reefs there that are in what's called a pseudo-high latitude environment. So this upwelling water that comes up each summer with the monsoon is actually much cooler than it should be in the summertime. So you can get an 8-degree temperature difference just over the course of a single day with this upwelling. You know, despite these extreme temperatures, we do have coral reefs around the area, and this region contains 6% of the world's coral reefs, which is pretty amazing given the small size of this area that we do have. And just to show you some pictures of these diverse reefs that we do have around here, this is from up near Ras Al Khaimah. Also near Ras Al Khaimah, coming a little bit closer towards Dubai. This is offshore here in Abu Dhabi. This is Dubai. And basically, I just wanted to introduce tonight by saying that the Gulf really does represent an opportunity. It was nice to hear in the film the discussions of climate change and its implications for the world. I personally believe that the assets that we have outside of our doorstep can be very informative for science. We are, as a rapidly growing population here, increasingly degrading these systems. And I think we're at real risk of losing these very important assets for science.
Thank you, John. I'm sure that climate change will be a very hot topic of discussion throughout this evening. So I'll move on to Colin Ford, who's a Miami-based marine biologist. And he's half of the art team called Coral Morphologic. So maybe you can talk a little more about that.
Sure. Thank you for having me. It's a great honor and privilege to come from Miami and speak about what I do and show some of my work. So I'm a marine biologist. I schooled at the University of Miami, but what I'm doing now with my partner, Jared, is sort of an attempt to hybridize the art and the science with the coral animal sort of as a living art form, which really they are. They're just such amazingly inspiring organisms. They've been around for 500 million years, and I think that, you know, as John was saying, you hear over and over in the media about how at risk and endangered corals are worldwide. And this is, you know, a message that we all need to really understand. But at the same time, I think that there's things that we can learn from the coral reef ecosystem that perhaps we can apply to sort of life in terrestrial life in the modern age. And so what you see here is the laboratory that we have in Miami where we're aquaculturing corals, and this is how we sort of sustain our ability to do the art by providing these corals to aquariums and for research. But so this coral aquaculture is, and then the research with coral aquaculture is something that is, you know, very important as we sort of move forward, because, you know, coral reefs are going to need to be restored and are sort of now beginning to be restored through these coral aquaculture techniques. So this is the lab based in Miami now. These are some of the soft corals that we aquaculture. These are called zoanthus, and they're quite popular with aquarists for their ornamental. You know, they're like flower animals. This is what you know, anthozoa is. Sort of corals are these animals. They're a bit like plants. They have elements of minerals, so they are truly you know, sort of a life form that is unparalleled on the planet. And so we grow these corals, and yeah, these are an example of how we are aquaculturing them in closed systems in a laboratory. And a lot of this technology is all very new. Our understanding of corals is really developing quite rapidly over the past 50 years. You know, really, it's easy to forget that we were not scuba diving before 50 or 60 years ago, which means that humanity really has only had a very short time to understand what coral reefs were like in the past. And these developments in technology have allowed us to really begin to understand the coral much more intimately. And so one of the things that we try to do in Coral Morphologic is to bring the corals into popular awareness and into popular culture. So for instance, in Miami, where we will do the public art installations, site-specific art installations, where we project corals onto limestone and concrete walls, because a lot of what we're working with are metaphors that sort of relate the similarities between the city and the coral reef, because the coral reef is very much, I would say, one of the most urban of the natural ecosystems on the planet. And that's where a lot of these sort of metaphors that I think we can learn from the coral reef. The idea of symbiosis, for instance, which was talked about in the movie, I found very interesting, for instance, with abalone farmers, where, by sort of all rafting together, there's safety and there's protection by being reciprocal to each other. And this is, you see these types of behaviors on the reef where you have so much life densely packed together. And so we've do these projections throughout the city of Miami, because we see Miami as a coral city. Miami has a lot of similarities to Abu Dhabi in the sense that it's a coastal city. There's not a lot of elevation, and sea level rise is a real issue. And Miami is built on what was once a fossilized coral reef, because at one time it was underwater. So all of the cement in the buildings of Miami essentially is the ground up fossilized marine life of millions of years and thousands of years in the past. And so the idea of projecting these corals back onto the buildings sort of alludes to both the geologic past, the technological present, and then the idea that if we're not thinking about sea level rise, these concrete structures that we've built as cities can eventually become an artificial reef, which is in fact what we're seeing in Miami, where corals are actively pioneering deeper into the city and living in places where they never were before. And this is really because the environment has been altered so much in Miami. Here in Abu Dhabi, you have desert, but in Miami, we have the Everglades, which is one of the most unique freshwater ecosystems on the planet. And with sea level rise, since we're based on this limestone, as the seawater sort of rises, we will lose this fresh water. And once the fresh water goes into the ocean, it's very difficult to extract that fresh water back out again, which here in a region that's dependent upon desalination, very well. So this is me diving next to the American Airlines Arena, where the Miami Heat NBA basketball team play. That was also where we have that last picture is the front. But in any case, this is also the American Airlines Arena. David Beckham, the soccer star, had proposed building a stadium, filling in this body of water here to build a soccer stadium in Miami. And I got in the water to document the fact that their corals have begun to pioneer and colonize the seawalls and the rocks inside this, otherwise what is not exactly a very pristine body of water. And I think that the corals that live in Miami are very interesting in that they are also quite resilient, which, with the work that John is doing here, these extreme tolerant corals are very important to understand, perhaps how corals worldwide and other regions are going to adapt. And Miami is a really interesting place. So that's more or less what I do. I guess a couple thoughts on the film is, water is the universal solvent, and I like that metaphor a lot, because it's chemically true, but it works metaphorically on so many different levels that, if there is magic in the universe, it is liquid water. All life is dependent upon it, and it's something that we really can't take for granted. So, yeah.
Thanks, Colin.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we move on to Lars Jan, who is a artist and filmmaker working on the ongoing large-scale multimedia performance of Holocene, and which deals with life in water and I guess out of water. So please go ahead.
Sure. I just first want to say thank you so much to Imagine Science Films and our other hosts here. I think the combination of art and science is something that I hope becomes a larger trend in 21st century discourse as our various areas of expertise become less specialized and siloed, and we understand the power of hybrid thinking and the importance of creativity in communicating complex ideas. And this seems like a great example of that. So I'm really excited to be here with y'all and to see what's going to happen, all the things that we're going to be able to watch over the next few days. This is a project called Holocenes. You may or may not know that we're living in a geologic epoch called the Holocene. I did not know that until 4 years ago. And that epoch has lasted since the last, I guess it began about 12,000 years ago, since the last ice age. And in 2010, I recognized that there was a series of devastating floods around the world that were passively affecting me, and I felt like were an aberration of some kind. But then I realized that it was no longer sensing, it no longer felt like an aberration, but I was completely unsurprised when there was devastating floods in Canada and the Midwest and many countries in Africa, various parts of Russia, Latin America. It's really hard to actually name a country where flooding is not a problem. This might be one of them. And once I did some more research into flooding, that turned me onto the story of water in the 21st century, and I began to feel like water was the lens through which the history of the 21st century would be written. And though flooding may not be the issue that's affecting this region, unquestionably, sort of the inverse problem, desertification, very well might be. And I wanted to find a way to translate and distill a lot of the different kinds of research that I was doing. For example, recognizing that we were in the Holocene and there was a current debate about whether we had actually begun a new geologic epoch called the Anthropocene, which is coming up under discussion. I believe it'll be sort of like ratified or decided upon in 2016, but there's a lot of geologists and other climatologists who are making the argument that humans, for the first time in the history of the planet, have begun operating on a geologic time scale, which is supposed to be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years. And we're used to, minutes, we got to do stuff later this afternoon, hours. But because we're not used to thinking on that time scale, and yet we're affecting our entire biosphere on that time scale, there's a really big disconnect. And that's one of the things that I think scientists who are used to thinking on that time scale a bit more than the rest of us are sounding this alarm overwhelmingly. As an artist, as I became interested in and deeper invested in the ideas that were coming out of the scientific community and a lot of the research from many different fields, I wanted to figure out how to make the information, translate the information to something that wasn't didactic and that was visceral, and that was a distillation of the way that the information made me feel. So Holocenes, the centerpiece of Holocenes is a very large aquarium, which you can view from 4 sides, which is situated in public space. And the key feature of the aquarium is actually that it's connected to a very powerful hydraulic system that allows the water to move in and out at varying speeds, sometimes frighteningly fast. So essentially, it's a flood machine, and within the tanks, performers carry out various everyday behaviors that we sourced from people around the world. People submitted behaviors of things they do every day, which is the time scale, again, as I was mentioning before, that we're normally operating on. At some point, I sort of started to feel like I make coffee every day, and when did I start making coffee every day? And though there are slight variations in how I make coffee every day, at some point that started taking up a certain portion of my life, and that little pattern, that little signal became part of who I actually am. There's things that I believe, but I invest a little bit more in the things that I actually do. And in addition to making coffee every day, I do a lot of other things every day, and I think along certain pathways every day. And I wanted to put those short-term patterns in conversation with an accelerated version of what's happening with water in the 21st century, potentially, with rising sea levels. I didn't want to simulate the engagement of these performers with water. I wanted to use the material itself, which was an engineering challenge. But a lot of people thought it would be a lot less expensive and a lot quicker to use video projections. So one of the things that's being transmitted right now is, we're projecting some photographs that I took. The point of the installation, though, is to actually exhibit a collision of the human body with 3,500 gallons of water moving very quickly in public space. And there's not really a way to represent what that feels like viscerally other than to experience it, because the materiality of the water and the volume of the water is something that we can kind of experience in 3 dimensions as people and relate to. I'm actually kind of water phobic. I have trouble in deep water when I'm in the ocean and I sort of can't touch the bottom. I start to breathe a little bit differently. I know a lot of people have variations on water phobias, and I think that's comes from a deep ancestral past. And there are other people who would rather be nowhere else. That's not me. This person is, he's trying to take a nap. As the water level changes, one of the features that a lot of the research led me to was the question of adaptation. How would we adapt? And I started to feel that adaptation was a double-edged sword. That adaptation has been this beautiful facility that our species possesses to get through the various challenges that we've faced. And at the same time, it gives us a sort of a large sense of hubris in that, well, we can, we've solved the problems before, we can solve the problems that are coming up. And that's not necessarily untrue, but it's at the same time, I think that our history of adaptation is working against us in this particular case. And that's what the installation actually looked like in Toronto when we premiered it for the first time this October, this past 2014. And we've only performed it once. And so we're working on some more performances, 2 coming up in the US, 1 in a few weeks in Florida, and the next in October in San Francisco. Multi-day, long durational performances. Thanks.
Thanks for that. Definitely something I want to get back to. Okay, so I'll start with some questions for everyone, and just to get your thoughts on some of the things that came in the movie and on a lot of the work that you do. But let me start with you, Colin, because you're pretty much very what Imagine Science is about. You were a marine biologist, and you went into filmmaking, which for me is quite strange. I mean, I've been doing science for too long, I guess, but how smooth is that? How does it work for you?
I would say that I have benefited greatly by riding a wave of new technology that is empowering all people everywhere. So when I was going to college from 2000 to 2004 studying marine biology, I had friends of mine that were studying photography at that time, and their professors were telling them, film will always be the best, digital will never overtake. Mm-hmm. And so 2006, digital SLRs come out, and I've started learning, that's when I started learning photography. And then in 2009, Canon comes out with the 5D Mark II, and it's a digital SLR that does HD video, and I can use macro lenses. And so we just became filmmakers because it was so much easier to do. In other words, 20 years ago, this transition would have been probably prohibitive, and it wouldn't have been easy to do these 2 things simultaneously. So this wave of technology that is, sort of happening in real time, and the advent of GoPro cameras and all of these, and just cell phone cameras, really, if you have the if you have the idea now, it seems like there's technology available to people to enact these ideas. And so that's, I mean, there's no secret really other than just, I think, you know, kind of riding this wave of new technology.
So the driver really was the technology. I mean, if the technology was not there, was it something that you would have liked to be doing otherwise?
I think, you
but
know,
couldn't?
as a child, you know, the idea of being an underwater photographer was very alluring and something I always wanted to do. But the idea of, you know, apertures and f-stops and things like this, you know, seemed way over my head. So, you know, it didn't become a reality until the technology made it such that I could, you know, go diving and see my pictures in real time underwater to know that, you know, it's a good picture, it's a bad picture, which, you know, in the age of film, if you travel halfway around the world to go photograph a coral reef, you know, you don't develop your rolls of film till you get back. And, you know, the process of learning, you know, would take so much longer and is much more expensive. So really, I mean, I take a lot of inspiration from, I guess, the DIY movement of punk rock. Sort of as a teenager, you know, listening to punk rock music, and punk rock music came from this idea that, you know, you don't need to have a big record label contract, and you can just go and make songs and record and put out a record. And that's really, I think, kind of the way that we came at the, you know, well, if we can figure out a way to do it ourselves. And the coral aquaculture sort of allowed us to vertically integrate so that there was a stream of income that could allow us to continue building. And that vertical integration, I think, gave us a sense of independence that didn't make us dependent upon grant funding. And although now we are, you know, now we do get some grant funding and art grants, but really, yeah, just the corals, because they clone and they're asexually reproduce through fragmentation, sort of became our currency. It's a currency that we could translate into American dollars, and then we could buy the cameras that we needed to do what we did. And for years, I always thought that some very wealthy individual would see what we were doing and say, I'm going to do that. And thankfully, we've been able to sort of create a unique niche. But Miami is also it is you know, really the only city in the United States that is on a coral reef, and like John was saying, you know, people from Miami don't realize what's in their own backyard, and that's been an important part of what we do is to educate with the local organisms, to the local people, you know, rather than trying to go to some exotic place and bring it back to Miami. You know,
yeah, it's right there, really.
It's right there. So so there is an educational component and an artistic component and a scientific component. The zoanthus that we're growing, the picture that I showed, is a new species, a species new to science that I recognize, you know, to be completely unique. But there are so few researchers that focus on some of these soft corals that, you know, it was just overlooked. Something that's incredibly interesting about the species that we find here in Miami is I've only ever found it living on artificial, man-made structures, jetties and seawalls and things like that. So if it's a species new to science, undescribed, where did it come from?
But that's an interesting sort of segue, because it's not just Miami that has this sort of pattern of, so, you know, humans have been moving into the marine environment or the aquatic environment generally, but they're starting to come back as well. So if you look at breakwaters in Abu Dhabi here or the Palms in Dubai, they're coated with corals. They have coral reef fishes across them. The same is true of Sydney and many other tropical cities. Yeah. So you get this sort of synergy going back and forth. It's an interesting balance.
I like the idea of, you know, with these breakwaters, you have a timeline where you know that, you know, these corals have only been there for, you know, X number of years, and it's almost as if it's a collateral benefit to the human engineering of the planet. You know, I consider Miami an inadvertent coral laboratory. You know, billions of dollars of private and public investment over 100 years have created these new environments that corals are moving into, and it's you know, the fact that they're living in water that, you know, most people would look at and say, I'm not going to get in that water. It's green and there's trash and there's corals there, and so, you know, just as it's important to go to pristine places and identify unhealthy corals that have diseases, I think that it's equally important to sort of go to these really disturbed or man-made habitats and, you know, look at the healthy corals and sort of look at them and say, you know, what is it about these animals that makes them so resilient?
Well, there is a whole branch of marine biology that's into ecological engineering, and there's a lot of literature out there looking at these. You know, if you take a place like Dubai, there's maybe 8 square kilometers of natural reef in Dubai. Well, there's much less now than there used to be. But there's over 65 kilometers of breakwaters in Dubai.
Wow, 65 kilometers. Ooh.
Yeah,
Sounds like paradise.
well, for coastal developers.
Well, I'd like to get back to the coral reefs, but I'd just like first to move on to you, Lars. And one of the themes that was very prevalent in the movie was how much we as humans are affected and how much we affect water. It's really part of everything we do, from living to worship to religion. It's been part of human history for so long. And well, another angle to that is it's such a destructive force as well, which I think you highlight with your exhibition with the floods. And I think even areas of the Gulf region here, they do get floods from rains as well. So I think a lot of people can relate to that as well. But I mean, I'd like to get your opinion on that, on the role of art in the if you'd say movement to educate people about climate change, about the changes that we can expect in our relation to water as the temperatures rise globally.
It's something I think once I started researching climate change, I realized there was many ways to approach the issue. It has many tendrils and from coming at it in many different fields, mutually self-reinforcing some of this, you know, often the same conclusion, but very different routes. And I found actually that it reminded me of the financial crisis, the collapse in 2008, that there's a system of basically algorithmic mathematics that became so complex that very, very few people could actually apprehend what was going on. And because it was so, I guess you could call it erudite in a way, it was of very little interest to most people. It was very different than kind of like buying, you know, bonds to support a war in World War II. It was like you're making kind of a direct investment or putting pennies in a bank. And that's like a tactility that I think most people socially, like when they learn about money, for example, they have that kind of a relationship to it. And then there are some people who get invested in this, like much in the finer points. And I find that in order to take and I think it's illustrated right here. In order to take evidence-based science and draw conclusions from it, whether it's about changes that have happened over 400,000 years or changes that have happened in the last few years, you have to communicate it. And a lot of times the scientific community, and I think it's happening a lot less, but one of the things I've heard the scientific community bemoan about itself is that it's communicating within itself. And there's this idea of preaching to the already converted, because 97% of scientists completely agree that, you know, humans have dramatically altered the biosphere. So there's no debate about that, but why hasn't it landed? And one is that, you know, one reason I think is that there's a finite pool of worry. So people have other things to concern themselves with, like getting food on the table and getting home from work and making sure that Sally's not sick. And
it's not happening tomorrow, so
it's not happening tomorrow. And so there's this issue of long-term thinking that's involved. So again, I think scientists have exercised a capacity in their brain to think about systems in the long term. But the general population, I don't think, has. And I think at a certain point, we evolved as a species to regard, like facilities in our brain evolved to think about, to make decisions based on the short term versus the long term.
Right.
And we make bets based on those things. We can make tiny calculations all the time. But the conditions in which we evolved have changed so dramatically. The question that I have is whether we're able to go through another stage of evolution, maybe physiologically, but probably more in terms of social evolution, so that we've done what we've done to the biosphere so rapidly. I wonder if we in turn can change how we socially make decisions in terms of the long term, and also empathically, in a way, equally as quickly. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of people who are pessimistic about that. I look at climate change as an opportunity, and I think art for a better world, because I think it's the first truly global crisis. And I think if there's anything that the human population globally as one system could finally rally around, this is the first thing that other than alien invasion, which I think would be a good one, and that's what science fiction usually uses. I mean, science fiction usually says, in the future, when all of the humans are federated and working together, the reason that is because we're fighting against some outside force. Well, this is a really good outside force without like the green men in spacesuits and the lasers. And I think art's role in that is communicating some of these complex, I think distilling, visualizing, and making visceral and public some of these complex, nuanced ideas as a first encounter with the public. And then as people's curiosities are piqued, or they have questions, what is that? Why is that? What is it about? Where can I learn more? That made me feel anxiety. That made me feel like it was about a dream. Whatever they feel, if they're coming at it from, if they're inspired to meet the science and meet the research themselves through a feeling that comes from the experience in the art, then that's what I'm interested in. And I didn't make this piece to do that originally. So I became more of an activist in the making of it. I really just felt a deep anxiety myself. And I had a vision about a box of water with water going up and down, and somebody, as the water goes up and down, not changing their behavior, but rather just adapting and ignoring it. And I felt like that was the best metaphor I could think of for what was happening. And then I realized, oh well, this is this can be of service to all of this research that informed where this idea came from.
And then you can use that to communicate to more people.
I hope so. Yeah, that's the idea. I think we're going to have to come at communities from all sorts of different ways. But I think communication is the key, and investigating and how creativity and the arts can be utilized to address this issue in particular, which I see no more important one to address.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, one of the things that we always talk about, at least in science journalism, is that we just don't know how to cover it anymore. I mean, we've done everything. We've covered it in every single way, and we've given the numbers 100 times, and people just don't care. So if I just go on for the 100th time and say that more than 2 degrees warming would be disastrous, nobody cares, because I've been saying that for a long time. So I think when maybe using art, you're actually approaching a different kind of sense, and then rather than where they're reading those words that we keep writing, it's quite interesting. Quite an interesting aspect of it, I guess. And John, I'd like to get back to you with the whole idea of coral reefs. And you are, I mean, the slide you showed of the variation of temperatures, that's amazing. I mean, I don't think any coral reefs in the world really witness that much variety of temperatures. And you're studying these coral reefs. I've heard it said before, it's kind of like looking into the future of the world, how it would look like in X number of years. So can you tell us more about that? What are you finding out of that?
Sure.
How can that help us in conservation, at least?
So if you take a typical Great Barrier Reef coral or most Caribbean corals and you put them at about 31 degrees Celsius, they'd be toast. And at 32, coral reef fishes would start dying off. But as I said, we have coral reefs here in Abu Dhabi that survive 36 each summer, 34 for several months. So what is it that makes these corals special is what drives the questions that I have here. But these temperatures that we're seeing here in Abu Dhabi, we're not expecting to see on the GBR or the Great Barrier Reef or the Caribbean for at least the next century. So, you know, we have time. We're doing a lot of interesting work here and through collaborators and various other people. We had a big conference here earlier this week on coral reefs, talking about what is it that we can learn from the reefs that are here that can then inform science in other areas. Are there ways that we can perhaps manually propagate this thermal tolerance that corals have here, or will they naturally propagate, for example, the Indian Ocean? So that's a lot of what's going on now, and I think there's hope.
So do you see a pattern where it's actually propagating to the Indian Ocean as the temperatures warm?
We have a lot of different information coming in. Some of it's contradictory, but the general story is that these guys are able to survive at incredibly high salinities and incredibly high temperatures that you don't get anywhere else. So let's find out what's making them tick. And we are doing, for example, crossbreeding work where we're taking Great Barrier Reef corals, the eggs of, and sperm from corals here. You can collect this stuff fairly easily, and finding out if that thermal tolerance is heritable or not. That's just one example of a variety of things that postdocs in my lab are working on.
And that's something also that, you know, I find, I try to put into perspective for people that, you know, for one, corals have been around on the planet for about 500 million years, and a lot of extinction events have happened in that time. Humans have been building cities for about 5,000 years, which, you know, is about an average age of a coral reef. So this perspective of time is something that is important to take into consideration. And what John just said also is that when corals spawn, you know, when they're sexually reproducing and creating a new generation, all the corals spawn at the same time, and that allows for a lot of genetic mixing. And this perhaps, you know, is one of the ways in which, you know, over a single generation or several generations of coral, you know, you can find the hardy, resilient survivors, you know, of those gametes. And you know, I think that's perhaps, from my perspective, maybe something that corals have going for them, is this huge genetic kind of mixing pot, you know, which. Because if you're a coral, you're the survivor, you die, because you're cemented in place. You can't just get up and swim away if it gets too hot. You have to deal with it. And the survivors are the ones that breed. And so, you know, I think that evolution can be, I think corals have some benefit of evolution working for them, or hopefully. I'm trying to be optimistic.
Well, if what you're finding in the region here is true, then that might very well be the case. I'd like to get some questions from the audience if anyone has any. We have this amazing light in our eyes. Oh, there's one person here. Can we get a mic here, please? Thank you.
Yes, this is a question for John. I dived on the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary off the coast of Texas. Are those corals there different species than what we would have? Is there a different set of species than we have here that are able to deal with that kind of temperature variation, or are they genetically similar to what you'd find in northern Caribbean?
So you'll have different species there, but what's interesting about the Gulf corals is that we have not that I'm aware of, no endemic corals that are only from this region. Virtually all the corals here are pantropical, and then there's a lot of them that are sort of through the Indian Ocean. So it's not like these guys are super special because they've explicitly evolved only here. They're around in a variety of different places. It's just that we've got this little pocket of water here where they've started adapting quickly. But the Gulf itself is young. It's only the modern coastline is only about 4 to 6,000 years old, depending on who you talk to. And it was bone dry during the last glacial period. So it's an interesting place to watch evolution unfold.
Thank you.
Do you have any other questions from the audience? I can see everyone now, thankfully. Oh, there's one here, please.
I guess this is probably more so for John, maybe. But just in terms of this idea of kind of the bridging the gap between science and art and the art aspect kind of influencing the public, but I'm wondering, as a scientist, if there's kind of this feedback loop of the art then influencing scientific progress in some way, and just if you've come across that at all in your research.
Well, you certainly see it now much more in the last sort of 5 years than you ever did, well, at least in my career. And going back to Lars' point earlier, scientists don't generally get any reward for talking to the public. We look at citations, impact factor, and things like that, and we talk only to other scientists, and that's how we get our grants. But clearly, in this sort of genre that I work in, if you don't get the public engaged, nothing's going to change, and we're just going to continue documenting the decline of reefs, and which is, has been going on since the 80s. It's been getting worse and worse. We are starting to see signs of recovery in a lot of places because the public is pushing back. And the reason the public is pushing back and asking the legislators and policymakers to start protecting areas and so on is because there has been a good movement from the folks in the arts, as well as communication generally, to get this message across. And I think there is a great deal of overlap, particularly on this issue of climate change, in trying to take science to drive the arts, and then it swung back the other way. And the arts are sort of informing some directions for science nowadays. If you look at a lot of the recent art exhibits that involve corals are all using fluorescence techniques, which are something that we weren't originally using ourselves for very much, but we've actually adapted it from the arts. And for example, I use fluorescence because if you shine a blue light on coral, you can see them, like they glow basically fluorescent. And I now use them in my lab, and various other people do as well, to find juvenile corals on reefs. So there's interesting things that are going on.
Let's use those pretty pictures of the corals. But well, I mean, on that angle, I'd be curious about this idea of where art and science really merge. I mean, that would be you, Colin, obviously. Sure. They merge in you, but is it, I mean, and I'd like to hear from you, Lars, and John as well. Is it tricky to get scientists to talk to artists or artists to talk to scientists? How can this be facilitated or made easier so at the end the public can benefit out of that? So maybe you can go, Colin, first, and then you can add comments as well.
Well, I consider science to be the pursuit of objective truth. So this is measurable, empirical, kind of concrete things that can be proven. Whereas art is a subjective type of reality. Everyone has their own opinion on that. And if you can kind of get these things to overlap, and also you hear a lot about sort of like left brain, right brain, thinking, science and art being, people say, oh, they're different types of brains or different types of people, but I think that trying to find that overlap between kind of finding some kind of subjective meaning from things that are objective, just awe in the universe. I mean, I think that alone should be enough to make people sort of want to ensure that the planet and humans are going to be around for future generations, because I mean the amount of technology and our understanding in just 100 years of knowing how old the universe is, and having a map of the universe, and all of these the Higgs boson, all these sort of really radical and groundbreaking objective discoveries are happening so quickly. It's just unfortunate that I guess the rest of the population can't also kind of see just how exciting of a time it is to be alive. And we're so distracted with our little everyday things, and putting food on the table, that just trying to create awe, I think, is something that both art and science are capable of doing. And that's awe is important to have a fulfilling life, I think, to be constantly, just sort of impressed with the world that we live in, which is an amazing world that we live in, and still so much to learn.
We we haven't exhausted everything yet,
No.
apparently.
I feel like artists and scientists are both groups that value deep conceptual thinking, and I think both groups are motivated at this moment by crisis. I mean, I'm not universally, but I think in general, crisis is a very good motivator for the human species, and I'm not surprised that those are groups that are responding more than maybe other groups are at the same time, and are kind of collaborating in new ways because of it. I also think, although science, is about objective truth, I also think science is actually about our perception of objective truth. Like, we are the observer of this thing, and that's where art really comes in. The idea of that mediation, our perception, our senses, and how we evaluate so-called objective truth is something that art is very, very invested in. That process is what's most interesting to me about art, actually. Probably, if I was to put it most simply, is just the art, perception itself. And we were talking about long-term thinking. We're talking about like the expanse of empathy. The Earth, and ecosystems as one system. The interconnectedness. Like, I think the point that you brought up that I wanted to come back to about Miami as a coral city, but really kind of corals as this empathic community. I find very fascinating, and I think. And I hope that I wonder what happens when we begin to address the issue of climate change. When we do, what actually comes after that? What's the other side of actually getting together and actually acting on that? Because I think there's other things that are happening on the planet that relate to that really big question that climate change is really big about our connectedness. And about connectedness of ecosystems.
Yeah, it seeps into pretty much everything, really, of human life in one way or another. John, what do you think? Is it easy for you to talk to art or to an artist to translate your work?
No, I think I work in a system that's fairly easy to aesthetically
You get to dive and go on chips, yeah, no.
Yeah, no. It's a lot easier to work in the system that I work with than guys with fluorescent lights and lab coats on. So I think it's inherently easy to sell the message of coral reefs, and art driving that is a fairly easy way to go.
On that note, I think we might as well call it an evening. It's getting late, and thank you all for being here today, and thank you for taking part in the panel, and thank you everyone for attending. And I hope you enjoyed the movie. I know I'll be thinking a lot about this for the next few days. It was just stunning, and yeah, maybe in a way it will change some, at least our habits. So thank you everyone, and on to you, Alexis.
Yeah, thanks, Mohammed. I just want to mention it's been a long day, the exhibit, the screening, the panel. So, but there's 2 more days of screenings. It starts in the afternoon tomorrow. And actually, the way we've structured the festival is we start in the water and we end up in the sky. This kind of poetic journey. But we have a film on Saturday called Sepida about an Iranian astrophysicist that played at Sundance. These are some of the films, some of the highlights. And obviously tomorrow we have the biophilia, and we also have a short program called Futures with some of our artists, Luis Nieto. I don't know if anybody tried the mouse keyboard, but there will be a film of Luis as well in that program. So, and I encourage everybody to also come to the short programs, because there's a lot of interesting programs. And Nate, who's the programmer, the films have a longer narrative to them when they're stitched together. So it's about the entire experience. But thank you to the panelists, and they'll be around. Lars, Colin are part of the exhibit, and John is our marine biologist, and will be
installation.
Permanent installation. And I urge everybody to walk to the other side of campus. I know a lot of people don't do that, but that's where the science is.
And also, I mean, thanks to the producers of the movie, who unfortunately can't be here, but it's just, I wish they were. It was absolutely stunning. So
thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Alex.